As we pause to commemorate and celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on what would have been his 93rd birthday, let us commit to continuing our thrust towards life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. After all, those are the cornerstones of our country's founding principles and the foundation upon which our fragile democracy has been built. Dr. King was, to my generation, one of, if not the, most admired persons on the planet Earth. I first met him during the weekend of October 15, 1960, at the second official meeting of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I, along with several other students from Claflin and South Carolina State Colleges in Orangeburg, South Carolina, joined other student leaders from across the country on the campus of Morehouse College in Atlanta. I learned during that meeting, which began around 10 p.m. and ended around 4 a.m., and many meetings since, that our differences stem more from our varied life experiences than any philosophical approaches, which in my memoir I call blessed experiences. That night, I had what I like to call my Saul to Paul transition. I have never been the same since that day. We marched to integrated lunch counters. We marched to get back off the back of the bus. We marched for various causes. In his admonition from King Street, South Carolina in 1966, Dr. King said to us finally, it was time to march to the ballot boxes. If there was ever a time for us to listen to King's plea, it is in 2022. The right to vote is the most fundamental thread of our democratic fabric. Without it, our democracy unravels, and we can no longer afford to straddle the line between democracy and tyranny while the people's access to the ballot box is repeatedly denied. So today, on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I urge you to keep in mind the true meaning of this celebration. This country doesn't have to be made great again. This country is already great. Our challenge is making this country's greatness accessible and affordable to all its people.
Last week, Vice President Harris and I visited Atlanta, Georgia, the cradle of civil rights in America. We paused and prayed at the crypt of Dr. and Mrs. King. We met members of their family, Dr. Bernice King, Martin Luther King III, his wife, Andrea, his daughter, Yolanda. We met students who were changing the world, just like generations of young people before them had done that. In fact, Dr. King was just one of those young people, 15-year-old student at Morehouse College when he began his journey to fulfill the promise of America for all Americans. A promise that holds that we're all created equal and deserve to be treated equally throughout our lives. Dr. King wasn't just a dreamer of that promise, he was a doer. And on this federal holiday that honors him, it's not just enough to praise him. We must commit to his unfinished work, to deliver jobs and justice, to protect the sacred right to vote, the right from which all other rights flow. The attack on our democracy is real, from the January 6th insurrection to the onslaught of Republicans' anti-voting laws in a number of states. It's no longer just about who gets to vote. It's about who gets to count the vote and whether your vote counts at all. It's about two insidious things: voter suppression and election subversion. In his time, through his courage, his conviction, and his commitment, Dr. King held a mirror up to America and forced us to answer the question, where do we stand? Whose side are we on? We're in another moment right now where the mirror is being held up to America, being held up again. The question being asked again, where do we stand? Whose side are we on? Will we stand against voter suppression, yes or no? Will we stand against election subversion, yes or no? Will we stand up for an America where everyone is guaranteed the full protections and the full promise of this nation? Yes or no? I know where I stand, and it's time for every elected official in America to make it clear where they stand. It's time for every American to stand up, speak out, be heard. Where do you stand? Whose side are you on? On this day of remembrance, service, and action, may God bless Dr. and Mrs. King and their family. And may God bless you all. May God protect our troops.
Today we unite to celebrate the light, the life, and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King knew our nation was founded on the promise of equality, with unalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness guaranteed to every American. And at a time of such challenge and controversy, like few others in history before, he took action bravely and boldly, carrying a message of love, a message of liberty and of justice for all that still rings true to this very day. We know there's still a lot of work to do, and we're committed to Dr. King's dream of making our country a better place for all. Let's do it.
Happy King Day. I'm Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, representing the 8th Congressional District of New York, and also the chair of the House Democratic Caucus. Let me thank State Rep. Barbara Gerwin-Hawkins for hosting this tremendous event. And of course, I'm so thankful for my good friend, Congressman Henry Cuellar, for all that he does to stand up for social, racial, and economic justice. As we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. King, he once said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I'm so thankful for people like Henry Cuellar, who've been laboring in the vineyards of the Congress and in the communities he represents to advance the cause of social, racial, and economic justice, advance voting rights legislation, advance police reform legislation, and advance criminal justice reform legislation as well. This is a challenging time, but we recommit ourselves to making America the best that it can be, to lift up the principles of liberty and justice for all, equal protection under the law. And I believe that because we have members committed to justice like Henry Cuellar, the best is yet to come. God bless you, God bless the great state of Texas, and God bless the United States of America. Happy King Day.
Greetings, my dear friends, as we celebrate the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who changed the course of human history with his life's work of fighting for justice for all. I join you today, and I thank God for the great gifts that we all have. I thank God for the gifts that I have in my life, and I thank God for the legacy and the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. Blessings to all of you. You know, Dr. King used to say that the time is always right to do the right thing. Well, we've seen a lot of wrong things happening in our country. It was a year ago on January 6th, 2021, that we saw the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. The work of those traitors that day was antithetical against every single thing that Dr. Martin Luther King stood for. Whether it was equal justice, the rule of law, standing up for democracy and using the system to make change for the better. All of those things were attacked that day and are being attacked right now by people who are trying to bring back the bad old days of racism and white supremacy and using things that are outside the scheme of law to try and tear down our country. In my office, I have a photograph of Dr. Martin Luther King giving a speech. And it's not the speech you might think of. It's not the speech at the Lincoln Memorial where there were 1 million people there. Because Martin Luther King didn't just start out there on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with a huge following. The picture is of him in a church basement with about 40 or 50 people there. And it took decades of work by Dr. King in small church basements with small groups of people, talking about the values that he aspired to for all of us. And they had to worry. They had to worry about, what was going to happen when they walked outside that building, who was going to follow them in their movement. But it takes that long life's work of small groups of people working together to make change. It's the only way to actually change the world, is when individual people who care are willing to sacrifice everything in order to make the world a better place to live in. I'm inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King, as I know each of you are. And I hope that we'll all continue to work together to make our world a better place, to make it a little more just, to make it a little more fair, and to never abandon the values that he's called us to do. I've devoted my life to public service, to trying to help people, to try and fight for equal justice, for fairness, to try and make people's lives better, whether it be because of race or because of income or because of background. I'll do everything I can to keep fighting for that. And I thank all of you for taking the time today to celebrate this amazing man's life and to remember that we are still continued to be called to the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Sherry Bustos. Today, we honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, legacy, and leadership. A man who committed himself fully to working against all forms of racism in our country. His teachings continue to guide us. Now, as we fight to preserve our democracy, the lessons he taught us are more important than ever. On this Martin Luther King Day, I encourage all of you to participate in this National Day of Service because we all have a part to play in advancing Dr. King's vision. Keep up the good fight. Happy MLK Day.
What an honor it is to celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We as one Virginia look back on our past and recognize how far we have come, and we can come together for a common future. Dr. King called us all to be better, to judge one another not by the color of our skin, but rather based on the content of our character. He started every day in prayer, and so do I. And I can't think of any better way to honor him today than to thank God for the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Hi, this is Burgess Owens. Today we honor the extraordinary life and unmatched legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., who inspired untold millions around the world through his dream of freedom. This dream is personal to me. I grew up in the days of KKK, Jim Crow, and segregation, the days of separate bathrooms, water fountains, and schools. I often say that Black American history is so rich because of the heroes that came before us, heroes like Martin Luther King Jr. and so many others, who recognized injustice, strove to help their brothers and sisters, and dreamed of a world outside the chains of inequity. Thanks to heroes like Martin Luther King Jr., my children and grandchildren, and generations to come, have the opportunity to live their American dream. What a difference men and women pursuing their dreams in a free country can make. As we honor Dr. King's legacy, let's reaffirm his devotion to creating a brighter future for all and continue our resolve to grow together as a more perfect union.
Congressman Don Norcross here. Today, I'm going to talk about urgency, something that drove much of Dr. King's work. In his famous I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King talked about the fierce urgency of now. He said, "This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy." Those promises are under attack. Across the nation, more than 400 bills have been introduced to restrict the right to vote, and there's widespread purging of voter rolls. We memorialize the January 6th insurrection, which struck at the heart of American democracy. This is not a drill. This is urgent, and it poses a direct threat to Dr. King's legacy and to democracy in the United States of America. I ask you to think of Dr. King's sacrifices for his fellow citizens. He was beaten, he was arrested, and he was ultimately assassinated. He believed deeply in the right to vote for all Americans. So while we honor him today through service, I want you to know that honoring Dr. King's legacy once a year is not enough. To uphold the legacy of Dr. King, we must embrace the idea of democracy and carry it forward every day. We must engage in our communities, participate in our local elections, and reinforce our democratic institutions. We must reject the luxury of cooling off. We must acknowledge the fierce urgency of now. And we must make real the promises of democracy. Thank you and God bless.
Today, we honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and recommit ourselves to building a more equal and just Michigan. We've all been through a lot over the last couple of years. Living through history is no easy task, and it seems like the world continues throwing new challenges our way and highlighting systemic issues that we must address. We have a lot of work to do to build a state that is worthy of our kids. We have to tackle injustice everywhere, protect our planet, invest in our families and communities that have been left out and left behind for decades, often by design. We have a big task ahead, and I know we are up to the challenge. We should heed the timeless words of Dr. King, who reminds us that we can enact change and uplift our communities if each of us continues to do the work. And he once said, we can never succumb to the temptation of bitterness. We must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. Because of every Michigander in our state who fights hard for the people they love, who cares for their community, who goes above and beyond even when no one is watching, I have infinite hope. I have infinite hope for our future because our kids are stronger, kinder, and more resilient than we often realize. And we have infinite hope because I know that when we work together, we're capable of greatness. I'm honored every day to serve as the governor of this great state. I look forward to living up to Dr. King's legacy and build a bright future for all our kids. When we do that work together, we'll be successful.
Come on, y'all. I know you got good shots. I know, right? Come on, you ain't got no excuse. Come on. I know some of y'all done seen y'all about 8 times. Come on, let's go. Keep moving.
You're one of the best.
You got good shots. I just messed you up. Come on, come on. Come on. Good job, good job.
You good, you good, you good.
Keep moving, don't stop.
I'm not gonna let you fall.
Watch yourself.
I ain't gonna let you fall. Yeah, and I have two. That's why I want you to fall.
5 podcasts over there. Come on, move it up. Watch your step, watch your step. Keep moving back. I'm sorry, I said. No problem. Walking on each other yet. Hey, y'all can get a horizon shot if y'all move back. Coming over the rim. Y'all will get a great wide shot if y'all move back. Let's go. It's a hell of a shot.
Like here?
I know. Who you talking to? I know.
Can't take them off either.
Right.
Good morning. I'm Congresswoman Alma Adams. On Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we unite as a community to do what history requires and honor demands. We pay tribute to the life of the Right Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights champion and one who valued service to all people. Dr. King said life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? He added, everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. Truly, service to others is fuel for our souls, and it is the rent that we pay for living on this earth. We celebrate a man whose tireless work on behalf of the less fortunate helped all Americans embrace the dream for freedom, dignity, and equality. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us through his life and words that love is the greatest force in the universe. It is the heartbeat of the moral cosmos. He who loves is a participant in the being of God. At this moment in our country's history, and with recent events, it's important to remember that Dr. King did not shrink from injustice. He challenged it. As you likely know, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, Dr. King wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." However, have you ever stopped to think what that means? It means that we have a moral obligation when we see injustice to speak up. We shouldn't abide injustice. We shouldn't sweep it under the rug. Instead, we should actively work to end injustice. That's not an easy task. But one of the most important parts of that letter is Dr. King's harsh criticism, not of the people who hold hate in their hearts, but of the people who hold the evils of the world to occur, who allow injustice because they fail to act. So to me, Martin Luther King Day is about action. We can't stand by and let injustice happen. We have a moral obligation to act. Taking action is uncomfortable. Often we'll hear different reasons not to act on injustice. Unity is a common refrain for those who want to avoid uncomfortable conversations. But as Dr. King said in that letter, we can't prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. During this pandemic, I've often thought of Dr. King's remarks on healthcare. He said, of all of the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane. And whether it's the shocking maternal mortality and morbidity rates faced by women of color, or a lack of access to affordable health care that causes thousands of preventable deaths each year, we must face the myriad injustices in healthcare. We must challenge injustice in wages, in business, in housing, in education, in voting rights, and anywhere it rears its ugly head. Justice is hard work, but we must do the work. That's how dreams become real, and that's how justice becomes reality. Thank you, and may God bless you on this day.
Dr. King, of course, was such an inspirational leader in the subject of justice and access to voting rights. And of course, my wonderful friend, John Lewis, now wonderful person who was at that march across the Pettus Bridge to make sure the freedom walkers, that the public knew of the determination of people like Dr. King, and now for all of us in the labor movement, the social justice movement, to make sure that this fight is not over, but we're not leaving the field. Every day we get up and fight for one another. Thank you so much.
Today, as we honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, we realize that his life's work is more urgent now than ever before. And that's why it's so important that we take up voting rights legislation. Pass legislation that will end gerrymandering, that will make sure the right to vote is protected. John Lewis said that the right to vote was precious, almost sacred. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is part of the legislation that we'll take up. This is the way we honor Dr. Martin Luther King, by continuing his life work and finishing the job that he started so long ago.
On this celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I am reminded of one of the many lessons he taught us. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Change takes a long time, but it does happen. I pray that as we reflect on his words and his life, we understand that action is required to make that change happen. Just recently, I proudly signed the very first posthumous pardon in Louisiana for Mr. Homer Plessy, who was wrongfully convicted of violating Louisiana's Separate Car Act of 1890. The purpose of that law was to ensure racial segregation as a means to promote white supremacy. It's taken 125 long years to right a historical wrong, but it has happened. And it was possible because of the Avery C. Alexander Act and the incredible concerted work of the families of Homer Plessy, Judge John Ferguson, Justice John Harlan, and the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office. There is never an expiration date on justice, and no matter is settled until it is settled right. Dr. King taught us to seek justice, pursue righteousness, and to love and respect one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. He showed us that when we unite across our differences and relentlessly, yet peacefully, fight for the basic human rights that God has endowed to all of us, we will succeed. Many things have changed, but we still have a long way to go. I am convinced that we can do better by one another, and by working together, we can make change happen. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and God bless.
Hi, I'm Congressman Mike Thompson, and I represent California's 5th Congressional District in the House of Representatives. I'm honored to recognize the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as we remember his legacy and great contributions to our country. Martin Luther King Jr. dedicated his life to the fight for equal justice under the law, marching for civil rights across the country, from Selma to Washington, D.C. The rights of voters are enshrined in our Constitution under the protections of the Republic form of government. Throughout our country's history, Americans have died protecting our Constitution from threats, and I served in combat with the United States Army to defend it. Now I'm serving my country in a different capacity, working in Congress to pass legislation that protects our democracy and ensures that people's voices are heard. I had the immense honor of serving in Congress alongside a civil rights giant, Congressman John Lewis. John was a dear friend and a colleague, and he understood the importance of the right to vote, calling it the most sacred tool in our democracy. That's why the most prominent voting rights legislation that the House has passed is named in his honor, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Action on voting right is long overdue, and the voices of the people must be heard. This is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue. It's an issue that John Lewis and Dr. King marched for, fought for, and dedicated their lives to. On what would be Dr. King's 93rd birthday, we remember his words in the letter from the Birmingham jail. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We must take action to defeat injustice and pass legislation that combats aggressive voter suppression laws that are being proposed in states across our country. To honor Dr. King and his legacy, we must protect the right to vote for every eligible American. Thank you.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is a time to reflect on the impact of the civil rights movement and its many leaders. We were able to work towards a better future for everyone today by building on their work and their legacies. Boston is uniquely connected to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. This is the city where Dr. King studied theology, where he preached at the historic 12th Baptist Church, and where he led a historic march to City Hall to protest systemic racism. Dr. King is among many civil rights activists that Boston has fostered. Here, we are home to journalist, activist, and suffragist Josephine St. Pierre, to the First Lady of Roxbury, Ms. Melnia Cass, to State Representative Mel King, to journalist and advocate and trailblazer Sarah Ann Shaw, and to so many Black activists whose legacies we build on today. These historic figures and today's activists understand that a city for everyone must be rooted in social and racial justice.
Today, we honor a great civil rights leader who was relentless in pursuing racial equality. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. never lost sight of the end goal. He remained steadfast in the pursuit of justice, regardless of how slow progress may have been. And this April marks the 54th anniversary of his assassination. Dr. Martin Luther King was killed for demanding that our country's principles of democracy and freedom apply to all Americans. It will forever be a mark on our history that a country founded in liberty and equality denied those fundamental rights to so many of its own people. Dr. King is remembered for his commitment to peaceful protest, even in the face of unimaginable hostility and aggression. And over the years, we have seen people disregard that roadmap that he created and give in to frustration or anger. But during those times when that frustration turns to anger, when it feels like progress is not being made, we must look to Dr. King's example. We must not only remember that he chose peace, but remember why he chose peace. Dr. King was a gifted orator, and many of his words have become famous because they speak to ethical and moral absolutes. On Christmas Day in 1957, he gave a sermon titled "Loving Your Enemies" at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. In that sermon, he said, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." Dr. King knew that racism, although perpetrated by ignorance, was hatred, and nothing will be solved by emulating the hate held by those who oppressed. There are frequent reminders that the work of Dr. King is not yet finished. Despite the undeniable progress that we've made in this country towards correcting our historical wrongdoings, we also know that the impacts of that racial discrimination still affect the American experience. A wonderful thing about the United States is that we have the freedom to speak out against injustice and, frankly, a responsibility to demand the very best of our country, to never stop trying to make the United States better than it was yesterday, achieving that goal set out by our founders in the preamble of a more perfect union. In moments when we were discouraged and enraged by perceived stagnation in that effort, we look to Dr. King as an example of how to proceed forward. This MLK Day, let us celebrate the work of Dr. King and honor him by choosing love, even in the face of inexplicable hate.
Today, we commemorate the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the activism he inspired and the world he shaped for future generations. We have endured unprecedented challenges over the past 2 years, from economic hardships to social and political polarization. But we can never lose sight of the dream that Dr. King instilled in us all. He said we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. Together we can create the world built from justice and righteousness that Dr. King dreamed of, where unarmed truth prevails and love triumphs hate. We cannot let setbacks and challenges derail us from making Dr. King's dream a reality for families all across Michigan and our country. And we cannot allow the very bedrock of our democracy, the right to vote, to erode before our eyes. We must safeguard our democracy against efforts that are seeking to undermine access to the ballot box. When Dr. King shouted from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, "Give us the ballot," he knew how the power of voting could make meaningful, positive change. And that's why passing voting rights legislation into law, including the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, is absolutely vital for protecting every American's right to make their voices heard.
Hello, everyone. On a hot summer day in 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. looked out onto the crowd gathered at Chicago's Soldier Field and called the city, our state, and our entire nation to action. We've come here today to remind Chicago of the fierce urgency of now. For now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Even as the temperature swelled to 98 degrees, the crowd grew into the thousands. They then peacefully marched by his side for the couple of miles to City Hall, unwavering in their belief that the freedoms they were fighting for were worth every bead of sweat that rolled down their foreheads. In Illinois, and when crisscrossing the nation, Dr. King asked us to imagine a better, fairer, kinder tomorrow. He spoke movingly about justice and of the great big power of even the smallest acts of kindness. He spread the
Good morning, and thank you, Toba, for bringing us together for the annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Breakfast and for serving as a catalyst for progress on civil rights. I'm thrilled that my dear friend and colleague, Congressman Emanuel Cleaver II, is today's keynote speaker. Reverend Cleaver is an outspoken advocate for voting rights, affordable housing, and higher wages. And people across America turn to him for inspiration and guidance. Reverend Cleaver was central to the passage of the historic bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And we watched together on the White House lawn just a month and a half ago when President Biden signed this blue-collar blueprint into law. Tampa is growing by leaps and bounds, and we know that this new law will help make our streets safer, improve transit, connect our neighborhoods, and keep Tampa Bay healthy and clean. Speaking of progress, in just another month, I invite you to celebrate the arrival of the historic statue of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune to the United States Capitol to represent the state of Florida. She will be the first African American to represent any state in the National Statuary Hall State Collection and will replace a Confederate general. Dr. King certainly would cheer this symbol of progress, a great educator and icon for equal rights. And he'd urge us to do more, to stand up for equal rights for all. And that's what we pledged to do this year in 2022.
When we reflect on what matters to us as Americans, things like equality, freedom, justice, it's hard to forget the remarkable leaders who fought to secure these rights in the ongoing quest toward a more perfect union. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s commitment to civil rights and leading with kindness changed the course of history. His mission and dream still serve as guiding light for our nation today. We can all learn something from Dr. King. His resilience brought power to his cause. His dedication to the path of freedom and avoidance of bitterness and hatred along the way. His dreaming, which inspired millions. As I work alongside my colleagues here in the Senate, I'm mindful of Dr. King's quote, that we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. Despite our differences, building understanding and listening with respect and being good and kind Americans to one another is the strongest answer. Today, let us all use this as a day of service and reflection. Thank you, and be well.
Hi everybody, Governor Roy Cooper here. Today we celebrate the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King's words still ring true. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? His words and wisdom continue to urge us to work together to solve our greatest challenges, like voting rights, access to health care and quality education, criminal justice reform, and racial equality. Here in North Carolina, we're working on it. I continue to tout our diversity as one of our greatest strengths, and our Andrea Harris Task Force, along with our Task Force for Racial Equity and Criminal Justice, are continuing to make important recommendations that are being adopted. We have more work to do, and it's on all of us to continue to build on the progress that we've made so far. Together, we can work toward a more just and prosperous future for all of North Carolina. Thanks so much.
I was recently reading a telegram that Dr. King sent to President Eisenhower after federal troops were sent to desegregate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I think it's an important frame for our remembrance today. It reads, in part, quote, "In the long run, justice finally must spring from a new moral climate. That justice continues to be our collective goal, creating a new moral climate. It's our collective responsibility." Although these lines were originally written in 1957, Dr. King's words feel incredibly relevant to the work that goes on today. However, I can't help but feel drawn to the rest of that quote that he wrote. Dr. King said, quote, "Justice must spring from a new moral climate. Yet spiritual forces cannot emerge in a situation of mob violence. In short, violence stifles the spirit and prevents progress. Throughout our history, there have been many moments where violence has prevented progress. It's frayed the ties that bind us together and taken us further from our nation's values. And whether that violence is found on the steps of a high school in Arkansas or on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, whenever Americans have turned on Americans, it is our responsibility to confront the ugly roots of this violence head on. How do we do this? In the face of such a challenge, it's natural to ask ourselves the fundamental question that Dr. King also asked: where do we go from here? The answer, I believe, lies with the path that Dr. King himself followed. In the moments where it feels that our moral climate is eroding and justice and progress are drifting further and further away, we drive out darkness with light. We drive out hate with love. So many people that I speak with these days are dispirited by the seemingly deepening divisions between us and the anger we see bubbling up in various acts of violence and hatred. Dr. King had his fair share of moments that tested his faith in our country. More than most, he suffered setbacks and adversity, as you all know. But crucially, Dr. King never failed in his belief that the better angels of America would prevail. He never stooped so low as to hurt others who were trying to hurt him. This, when you think about it, is downright heroic and so relevant today. He had a moral advantage that, in the long run, prevailed. He had a vision of where this country could go and what it could be. It was a dream that, as he said, was deeply rooted in the American dream. His words are more relevant than ever today, whether he was preaching from the pulpit, writing from a jail cell, or addressing the crowd gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Dr. King's words still guide us. And in this new year, as we navigate through the darkness that can feel at times like it's all around us, I encourage you to take a moment. Look to your left, look to your right, and find the people who will sustain you, who give you faith, and who give you courage to take the high road and play the long game. So on this important day, let us recommit ourselves to the work of fostering a new moral climate. Let us strive towards the dream of the dreamer, justice in our beloved country.
Hello, I'm Governor Kathy Hochul, and I'm honored to be part of New York State's celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On this day, we pause to reflect and remember Dr. King's teachings of justice, peace, equality, and love. His impact was, and still is, immeasurable. He famously observed that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And in a way, that was a self-fulfilling prophecy because he did as much as any one person could do to bend it. He did so through his words and his actions, which were guided by his deep, abiding faith in people, something that was all the more remarkable given a lifetime confronted by injustice. As we celebrate his legacy, it's up to each of us to reward that faith and to do everything in our power to build a better, more just society. We must remember that we are divided, we falter alone, but we are united, we rise together. Dr. King has long been a guiding influence in my life. He said, "The time is always right to do the right thing," and I have tried to live by those words throughout my career. I know the past 2 years have been incredibly challenging for everyone. We've confronted a public health and economic crisis, as well as social and political unrest. We have once again found ourselves face to face with tragedy and injustice. And it would be easy to give up and back down, but that's not what New Yorkers do. We rise to the occasion and the moment, not because it's easy, because it is the necessary, right, and just thing to do. And that is why New York is a beacon to the world, and that is why we'll emerge from this moment stronger than we were before. By doing so, we'll honor Dr. King and do our part to bend the moral arc of the universe toward justice. Thank you.